Hello, I'm Dan Gibson, and this is another video in the series Archaeology and Islam. Our topic today is about the origin of the mihrab. When was it invented? Why was it invented? And what was used before it was invented? For a long time, I have felt the need to write something about the origins of the mihrab because I cannot find it clearly laid out by any other writer. In recent years, Andrew Pedersen noted that the mihrab was a later invention and was not used in the earliest mosques. In 1999, Routledge published Pedersen's Dictionary of Islamic Architecture. In just over 300 pages, Pedersen covers the major mosques of the Islamic world. He addresses the Banbahor Mosque on the page 32, and he notes, significantly, there is no trace of a concave or projecting mihrab, which confirms the mosque's early date, as the first concave mihrab was introduced at Medina in 707 and 709 AD. In addition to this, Pedersen has a dictionary heading on the mihrab. It says, Mihrab, niche or marker used to indicate the direction of prayer, usually in a mosque. A mihrab is usually a niche set into the middle of the Qibla wall of a building in order to indicate the direction of Mecca. The earliest mosques do not appear to have had mihrabs, and instead the whole Qibla wall was used to indicate the direction of Mecca. Sometimes a painted marker or a tree stump would be used to reinforce the direction. In the cave, beneath the rock in the dome of the rock, there is a marble plaque with a blind niche carved into it, which, if contemporary with the rest of the structure, may date to 692, making it the oldest surviving mihrab. The first concave mihrab appears to have been inserted into the Prophet's Mosque at Medina during some restorations carried out by the Umayyad Caliph al-Walid in 706. Excavations at Wasit in Iraq have confirmed this date for the introduction of the first concave mihrab, where there are two superimposed mosques. The lower one, datable to the 7th century, has no mihrab, whilst the upper mosque has a concave mihrab. Now that was the dictionary definition by Pedersen. Pedersen also notes the history of the mihrab in his entry on Wasit. Here it is. Wasit lies southeast of the modern town of Kut in southern Iraq. It was founded in 701 CE by Hajjaj, governor of Iraq, as a garrison town to replace Kufa and Basra, which had been demilitarized after a revolt against the Umayyads. In 874, note this is 170 years later, another Friday mosque was built by the Turkish general Musa ibn Bugha in the eastern part of the city. The devastation wrought by the Mongols in the 13th century and by Timur in the 14th hastened the decline of a city which was no longer on the main trade routes due to a change in the course of the Tigris. The first mosque on the site was built by al-Hajjaj in 703, measuring 100 meters per side. It was located next to the governor's residence. Iraqi excavations reveal two superimposed mosques, the earlier one which had no mihrab. This confirms the early date of the mosque, as the first concave mihrab was introduced by al-Walid in 707 to 709 in the mosque in Medina. We know about this reconstruction in Medina from al-Tabri, volume 23, page 141. While the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina underwent a major rebuild, al-Tabri notes that the foundations were relaid and the Qibla wall was changed. Many of the early mosques underwent regular rebuilding as they were expanding to accommodate larger and larger numbers of people. This was normal, and al-Tabri doesn't note many of these, but in Medina he adds the important bit of information that makes this noteworthy. The Qibla Qibla wall was changed. From my survey of over 150 of the earliest Qiblas around the Muslim world, the change in the mosque construction observed by Pedersen can clearly be seen. Moreover, it seems that the change in the Medina Qibla wall mentioned by Al-Tabri was part of a significant shift happening on a wider scale. Soon after this, new mosques started facing Mecca in Saudi Arabia, and these were all constructed with mihrabs. But mosques still facing Petra generally did not have a mihrab niche. Sometime after the Mosque of the Prophet's Qibla wall was changed, a mosque to the northwest of the Prophet's mosque was rebuilt and became known as the Qiblatain Mosque, as that mosque maintained its old Qibla facing north as well as having a new Qibla facing south. In my database, there are numerous mosques which demonstrate the Qibla change from Petra to Mecca. It is my hope that scholars will pick up on this change and address it more thoroughly sometime in the future. Now, it's interesting to note that in some of the surviving mosques with two Qiblas, that one Qibla is often given preference over the other. For example, in the Ibra Qiblatain Mosque in Oman, seen here, the mihrab towards Mecca is notably larger, and the old Qibla towards Petra is much smaller. And even after the mosque was rebuilt, they maintained the two Qiblas in this mosque. In his Dictionary of Islamic Architecture, Pedersen highlights the importance of the two mosques in Wasit. The first mosque in Wasit was constructed by Al-Hajjaj, and it was later torn down and a larger mosque was built right on top of the old mosque. Archaeological investigations started there in 1936, and excavations took place from 1939 to 1945 by Fuad Safar, who later became the Iraqi Director General of Antiquities and Heritage. The large Hajjaj Mosque and a building known as the Minaret was cleaned out, and it included a tomb and a school that dated back to the 7th century. Preservation took place on parts of the minaret due to walls being torn and worn out, but really no maintenance was carried out. So the place is still very much in ruins. On the right is a drawing made by the Safar expedition. This is the older Hajjaj Mosque that was underneath the later mosque. The drawing on the left was made by Cresswell, showing the two mosques and their orientations to each other. There are several things to note from these drawings. First, as Cresswell's drawing shows, there are two mosques, one above the other. The earlier mosque was built by Al-Hajjaj and faces a between position, as did all of the mosques that Hajjaj commissioned during his lifetime. The later mosque was built on the same location, but with a different orientation. As can be seen from the Wasit Mosque and also from the two superimposed mosques in Tiberias, the original building was torn down, the rubble was spread over the old foundation, and then the new mosque was built above the old one. In this way, the original foundation was preserved so that today archaeologists can determine the foundation of both mosques. To fully understand how the mihrab developed, I find it helpful to look at a timeline. The timeline below illustrates the qiblas used in new mosque construction, from the start of the Islamic era until around 250 after the Hijrah. We will not look at everything in detail, as most of these subjects have been covered in other videos. During the reign of Uthman bin Affan, the Caliph ordered a sign to be posted on the wall of the Prophet's mosque in Medina so that the faithful could now identify the direction in which to address their prayers. Up until this time, historians could not explain this development, since they assumed there was no question as to which direction the faithful should pray. The entire building always faced the Qibla. But now, however, a sign was provided, seeming to indicate that there was some question about the Qibla, and maybe a new optional Qibla had been introduced. In this year, Al-Walid Abd al-Malik ordered the pulling down of the Mosque of the Messenger of God, may God bless and preserve him, and the pulling down of the rooms of the wives of the messengers of God, may God bless and preserve him, and the incorporation of them into the mosque. Muhammad bin Umar mentioned that Muhammad bin Jafar bin Wardan al-Banz said, I saw the messenger sent by Al-Walid bin Abdul al-Malik. He arrived in the month of Rabia in the year 88 in a turban wound around his head. He entered into the presence of Umar bin Abdul Aziz, bearing Al-Walid's letter, ordering him to incorporate the rooms of the wives of the messengers of God, may God bless and preserve him, into the mosque, and to buy the land behind it and beside it, so that it might measure 200 cubits by 200 cubits. He also said to him in the letter, change or move the Qibla if you are able, and you are able, because of the standing of your maternal uncles. Now that's from Al-Tabari, volume 23, page 88, telling us about that change. So during the reign of Al-Walid, the mosque of the Prophet was completely renovated, and the governor of Medina, Umar al-Abdul Aziz, ordered that a niche be made into one wall to designate the Qibla. Uthman's sign was then placed inside that niche. Apparently, the niche came to be universally understood as identifying the Qibla direction, and so came to be adopted as a feature in other mosques. A sign was no longer necessary. I don't think it was a coincidence that the date shown that very soon after Hajjaj changed the mosque orientation, the Mihrab niche started to be used, most likely to lessen confusion in some mosques. We can see from the mosques we have examined that the Mihrab did not become universal until the Abbasid era, and by then it was associated with a Mecca Qibla. It seems that there may have been confusion in some mosques over which way to pray, so new mosque construction adopted the mihrab, so that the faithful could pray in confidence towards Mecca in Saudi Arabia. But where did the idea of a mihrab come from? I would like to suggest that it came earlier. Here's a satellite photo of the first Kaaba in Petra. Around it was a walled courtyard with the temple of Dushara Hubal on the south side and the west wall of the courtyard. In that wall there was a niche where the wall curved around the gravestones of Ishmael and Hagar. I would like to propose that the first mihrab was based on the Hatim wall of the Petra Kaaba. That niche was an integral part of the Kaaba complex. So when a new Kaaba was built in Mecca in Saudi Arabia, people also wanted a curved Hatim wall. We learn from Al-Tabari, volume 20, that Ibn Zubair in 65 after the Hijrah had the Hatim wall attached to the Kaaba. Abdullah ibn al-Zubair rebuilt the Bayt al-Haram, incorporating the Hijr within it. That is from Al-Tabari, volume 20. And this is what we see in Mecca today. The Hatim wall in Mecca was placed so that it is closer to the Kaaba and attached to it. I believe this gives the Kaaba direction so that it is facing the first original Kaaba. In a way, the Hatim wall in Mecca is acting as a mihrab because it faces towards the original Kaaba in Petra. This illustration shows the orientation of the Kaaba around the Hatim wall in Mecca. It seems that a new function is now attached to the Hatim wall, now orientating people towards the original Kaaba. So what better way to illustrate the direction of prayer in a mosque than to use a niche in the Qibla wall? According to the Huma al-Numur inscription in Saudi Arabia, the Kaaba there was constructed around 65 after the Hijrah. Al-Tabari tells us that Ibn Zubair demolished the Kaaba, the first one, and placed the black stone on a silk wall in a temporary wooden stand. This is also the year that Abdullah ibn Zubair claimed that he found the original foundation stones that Abraham laid for the first Kaaba. but no location is mentioned for where this Kaaba was. However, we can date the Kaaba in Saudi Arabia through the Huma al-Numur inscription, and specifically through the attaching of the Hatim, or the curved wall, to the north side of the Meccan Kaaba. This small curved wall faced the Hijr of Ishmael, or the Rock of Ishmael, that marked the burial place of Ishmael and his mother in far-off Petra. So I would like to propose that this curved wall was the basis of the first mihrab ever constructed. After this, a curved wall in the form of a niche was incorporated into new mosque construction. Some builders decided to add a mihrab to some earlier buildings as well, such as the Qasr at Khirbat al-Mafjar near Jericho. In this case, the wall to an inner room was opened up and a new reinforced wall was added facing the between Qibla. A later Qibla was also evident at the Dome of the Chain in Jerusalem. This structure is beside the Dome of the Rock, but much smaller. From the use of the different construction materials, we see that the Qibla on this structure was a later addition, indicating that the faithful should pray towards Petra in this case. Now, the last thing we want to address is how to identify places of prayer before the mihrab invention. In most mosques, one only has to look for the Qibla wall. This is a wide, flat wall across the front of the mosque. If the mosque is square, then all four sides have got to be considered, but usually there's rows of pillars, and that can identify the front and the back wall, as Muslims like to line up in long, wide rows, where everyone is shoulder to shoulder, but with the person beside them. Because of the positioning of the pillars, this is usually possible to identify two different directions. Now, the front is usually obvious since the door to the mosque is usually at the back. So even without a mihrab, it should immediately be obvious which way the faithful faced in the mosque. From the Qasr at Humayma, the long wide room to the north end of the Qasr appears to be the prayer room. Notice it has direct access to the central courtyard, so that visitors or people don't have to walk through residential quarters in order to reach the mosque or the prayer room. In Khirbat al-Minya near Jericho, the prayer room is at the southern side of the Qasr, and again it opens directly into the courtyard. It may have been the room at the center, or most likely the room on the bottom right corner. The center room may have been a reception room for the Caliph. Now, no mihrab is present in either of these Umayyad structures. They predate the making of the mihrab. Now, in closing, let me address something Pedersen said in his definition of the mihrab. He stated, in the cave beneath the rock of the Dome of the Rock, there is a marble plaque with a blind niche carved into it, which, if contemporary with the rest of the structure, may be dated to 692, making it the oldest surviving mihrab. That idea of the oldest surviving mihrab has been challenged by Eva Bayer in her article, The Mihrab in the Cave of the Dome of the Rock. She arrived at the following conclusion. The characteristic details of the mihrab in the cave of the Dome of the Rock suggest two conclusions. First, the date cannot be earlier than the second half of the 9th century. And she goes on and explains that. And then she says, second, it is possible that the actual sponsor of the mihrab was a member of the Ikhshidid or the Fatimid dynasty. This dates the mihrab much later, so it is not a candidate for the original surviving mihrab. In this video, I have tried to demonstrate that the mihrab was a later invention that came into play when Hajjaj began building his mosques using a between qibla. A few years later, it was adopted by the Abbasids and used in mosques ever since to indicate the direction of prayer towards Mecca in Saudi Arabia. But the very earliest mosques did not have a mihrab. They had a simple qibla wall. Nothing else was needed, since originally all mosques in the first years of Islam faced Petra in southern Jordan. It was only after other qiblas were introduced that a sign and later a mihrab was introduced. I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video in the series Archaeology and Islam.